In December of 1993, I was 13 years old and my family had just moved to Coleman, Texas. We stopped by the video rental store in Coleman and we picked up a few PBS documentaries about working cowboys. I really don't remember much about the first two that we watched, but the third one we put in was actually a video of an Austin City Limits concert featuring Michael Martin Murphey and friends. And one of the friends was Waddie Mitchell, and it was the first time I had ever heard anybody recite a cowboy poem. I absolutely fell in love with cowboy poetry after hearing that, and I sought out Waddie's records as quickly as I could. I listened to those records so many times that I memorized some of his poems without even trying. My favorite, and the first one I ever recited, was A Story with a Moral. It's the same poem that he had recited on that Austin City Limits concert. A couple of years later, I was having dinner with my family at a little barbecue cafe in Ropesville, Texas. The cafe was called Beaver's Crossing, and somehow the owner of the cafe, Buddy Beavers, knew that I recited a few cowboy poems, and he said there was a table of senior citizens having dinner around the corner, and he asked if I would be willing to recite a poem for him. Well, I agreed to do it, and he introduced me to the table, and I launched into Story with a Moral, which was not really an appropriate poem for a bunch of old folks right in the middle of their meal. And on the way home, I realized that my parents were mortified, and I think Buddy Beavers was too. But I guess it turned out okay because Buddy asked me to perform again and even hired me a little while later. I hope my first podcast goes smoother than that first public performance, but I'd like to recite that poem for you to kick things off. This is Story with a Moral by Waddie Mitchell. Now, I know there's things worse that make cowpunchers curse, and I reckon it's happened to us all, and though it's been years since, you can bet when I think of it yet, it still makes my old innards crawl. You see, I was making a ride to bring in one hide that hadn't showed up in the gather. I was riding upstream, daydreaming this dream, when I thought, there's something the matter. There's some quaking asp trees I'd caught in the breeze, a stench that was raunchy and mean. I reckon it's how it might be that old cow. So I rode to a bend in the stream. Sure enough, that cow'd lied in the creek there and died. Hard telling how long she had been there. She was bloated and tight. It was a horrible sight. She was oozing and slipping her hair. Her eye sockets were alive with maggots that thrive on dead flesh, putrid yellow and green, and the hot sun burning down, turning pink things to brown, spewing oily gunk in the stream. Well, I spurred upwind fast to get away from the blast of the heavy stench that cow made, and I felt bad seeing as how I'd lost the old cow, so I pulled up near a tree in the shade. And then I got sick to the core, remembering just moments before I'd done something made me feel worse. Not 30 yards down, I'd stepped off to the ground and drank till my belly near burst. Well, for months after that, just the thought made me spit, and I'd live it over like a bad dream. And the moral, I think, is that if you must take a drink, never ever remount and ride upstream. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. Each episode I'll interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy west and beyond. My guest today is cowboy poet Waddie Mitchell. Waddie was a working cowboy for 26 years before he became a full-time poet. He helped to organize the very first cowboy poetry gathering in Elko, Nevada, and went on to perform on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, record 3 albums for Warner Brothers, and take cowboy poetry to the world. Waddie's been a real inspiration to me over the years, so it's a real honor to have him as my first guest. Here's Waddie Mitchell.
Well, you're also talking to an old man, so I might get things fouled up myself. But I was born and raised on a ranch. And so that was my life from the very start. We were very remote and went to town maybe 4 times a year to Elko, but often to Jigs, which is the little community that we live in again right now. And it is a little ranching community. Jigs consists of about, well, let's see, there's a 1-room schoolhouse. There's kind of a community hall, we call it. We have a couple dances there a year, and the kids will put on their Christmas show and their Easter show there from the school. But the reality of it is I had no other idea. And when it come time to go to high school, I had to board in. And to take me from the ranch and everything I knew and put me in this huge school with 220 other kids in it, high school, was daunting to me. And they all played football because that's what they did as kids. And they all played basketball because they did that as kids. They played baseball, which now in Jigs, the school district would come out and give us a baseball and a basketball and a football. So during football season, we played keep away with the football. Then during basketball season, we played keep away with the basketball. And then during baseball season, we played catch. And so I wasn't comfortable. Even in small town Elko, which was a cow town, the city kids called the ranch kids sodbusters, which really made us mad because, of course, there's no farming in Elko County in those days at all. You put up hay, but it was meta hay. And so I felt like I could do without school. And at 16, I got quit, and I got quit because I got a job on the 7S Ranch, which was one of the ranches in Elko County still pulled the horse-drawn wagon out. And in the 2 years I was there, that was the end of the horse-drawn wagon. They built, had a big 2.5 and built a nice covered kitchen on it for the cooks. It was getting harder and harder to find cooks in those days that could drive a team and get everything done that needed done. There was no pay in it, so if you could cook, you went to a restaurant. Every once in a while, a guy'd find a good cook. But one time we had, right there at the 7S, we had a guy that come out. He was a younger feller, maybe 30 years old, and he wore black pants and a black shirt and had a double holster with 245s a-setting on his hip. He had a big German Shepherd dog that, of course, didn't know anything about a cow. And about the 3rd time he got somebody bucked off a colt, that just run up and bite their heels. We told him he had to keep his dog tied up. That didn't make the cook happy. We was all going to go off to the 4th of July celebration, so he got 5 days off before that, and then he was going to come back and tend to camp. Well, we got back to camp, and there was an old wrangle horse there that was barefooted, and he rode that. He stole Bill Whitman's saddle and rode that horse 60 miles down a gravel road to the headquarters, and then somehow caught a ride to somewheres. And so it pretty much crippled that horse, and that made everybody mad at him. But I was the youngest feller on the crew then, right out of being 16, so I had to take the cooking chores on for until Johnny Welch, the cow boss, could find another cook. in those days, out on that wagon, most of the time you just, find something that didn't get gathered the year before was a yearling. And they were about, 600, 650 pounds, was just about the right size for a big crew. You could butcher that thing and actually eat it up before it went rotten, which was, in those days, you'd hang it up at night to get cool, and then you'd wrap it up in a tarp and put it under the wagon to kind of keep it going. Well, I jerked that thing out of the wagon and I unrolled it, and it was just alive with maggots. Well, crippling that horse was bad enough. Getting guys bucked off with his stupid dog was bad enough. But boy, when we've been thinking of all them meals we'd ate with that nasty maggot-infested piece of meat, guys were ready to kill that cook. But it turned out good. I got to go out with the wagon, and of course in those days, really, a cowboy didn't make any money. I made $125 a month, and 25 of that was because I was riding colts. And so you didn't have money, you didn't get any prestige, but you always had the right to quit and go somewhere else. And you didn't need a good reason to quit. It might be just a itchy, feet to get gone and go somewhere else, see some more country. So that's why the crews were constantly changing. Oftentimes you worked with a lot of guys on crews you'd worked before with, but it was just about impossible to duplicate a crew again that you worked with. But I got to tell you, of all the crews I worked with, that first crew, and maybe it was because I was young and learning so much over that period of time, that I've always considered that the best crew. And half that crew were Shawnee or Shoshone or Paiute or Navajo. And so we had a wonderful, diverse crew, and we had a crew that could keep you laughing. Growing up on the reservations, they all gained this dry sense of humor. And they're tough enough that, if you got piled off in a bunch of cactus and rocks, they'd first check to see if you is dead, and if you weren't dead, you'd get laughed at for 2 or 3 days. They'd make jokes about that. But it was a wonderful experience. From there, we went to the Circle A Ranch, at that time Nevada Garvey. And that spring, we turned out 25,000 head of cattle on the Owyhee Desert. And we started in February and didn't get turned out until almost the end of April. And we were branding on the way a lot of times. If it just happened to be we had, something going that we could gather up 60 head of those calves or something, we could just brand on the way and then just keep going. It showed me just how efficient branding could be. We used Jake stakes there, which are big stakes drove in the ground with a nylon rope tied on the end of it and like a iron hondo. And what we'd do is rope that calf any way you could, generally by the hind feet, but there's nobody on the ground. You didn't wrestle calves. The only guys that wrestle calves is when you drove by the Jake stake, then they'd grab it and put that rope around their 2 front feet, and then your horse held the calf down. Made an easier day out of it for the cowboys, and I think a little more efficient. I really do. But we roped every day. That outfit would furnish you tobacco. If you could, roll your own, it was always Bull Durham. And they furnished you your lasso ropes. He'd come out with a coil. Short rope in that country was 50 feet long. Most of us carried 60, 65 feet, some guys longer, but they were, the 5/16 scant. And so they weren't big ropes, but they were the perfect rope for the big desert country, because a lot of times you're out there yourself. And, those guys that tie off are the guttiest boogers I've ever been around. I want to just get on the other side of the corral whenever I see a feller tied off. But then again, you go to those guys and they say, we get out of their corral when you crazy boogers are dallying. So since then, the world has changed. We always had the chinks and the tapaderos, and oftentimes a single rig saddle. Nowadays, you see chinks in Texas and Louisiana and everywhere. Western horsemen and things like that a cowboy would just kind of cherish and read and look at the pictures. And look at the pictures there and stuff and just dream. We started changing around a little bit. You'll see silver bits out here now where they used to laugh at them if you showed up. But you also, out in our country, see a lot more double rig saddles, and you'll see a lot of the technique that these guys in Texas, in the brush, was handling. They could come out to our part of the country and teach us something. And, of course, we taught them something, and all of a sudden we're kind of homogenizing. It used to be a feller pulled out his rig, and you knew pretty well where he was from, even the shape of his hat. And now, although there's sure enough a Texas look and sure enough a Nevada look, it's not strange to go to Colorado and see a little of both, or go to Idaho or Nevada and see a little of both on the big outfits.
Good cowboys, like good poets and good musicians, are lifelong learners, always looking for ways to make their work more efficient. Waddie mentioned to me that the reason Texas cowpunchers and Nevada buckaroos started exchanging ideas is because of the cowboys' desire to learn. He goes on to talk about attending the very first Ray Hunt clinic, what makes a good crew, and how he got to be boss on an outfit.
A cowboy, for some reason, more so than so many other things you could be employed in, is always trying to make a better horse, is always trying to figure out a better way to do it where the cattle are not as stressed, are always figuring out a better way to conduct the day. And with that, we are getting the best out of all the worlds, and I can guarantee you, right now, these young fellers out there cowboying, on the whole, are better horsemen than we ever were. Work cattle nicer and slower and more efficient than we ever did. And I think a lot of that had to do with guys like Ray Hunt, who I was lucky enough to go to his very first ever clinic. I was starting colts for the 2U ranch at the time, and the boss come to me and said, "Hey, we bought you. We want to send you to this clinic. They got this California fella coming up, and he's a horseman." And it not only hurt my feelings, it made me mad. Hey, I'm your horse breaker. Why would I need to go to a prune picker to learn anything? And I got there, and Ray Hunt, was as excited as we were about this whole deal. And he's humble. And within an hour, before we even started the clinic, we all showed up at 6 a.m. The clinic was supposed to start at 8, but he showed up at 6 too, and we all drank coffee. And by the time we got done with that coffee, we was all ears. And we watched him do things with colts that we knew happened, but we'd never put it together before. We had this knowledge over here to the right, and we had knowledge over to the left, and we had knowledge above us and below us, and we could talk about those individual pieces of knowledge. But we had never bunched them up to where it all was starting to make sense. And when he gave that to us, not only had the way we started horses, or the way we handled horses, or thought about horses, what he taught us about that extended to good dogs, or working dogs, extended to cattle. And guys started reading cattle better. Instead of rolling your horse into your saddle and having a big bronc ride when you leave out of camp in the morning, which we like to talk about now in our poetry, but you don't like to do at 4 o'clock in the morning in the dark out in the middle of nowhere. Joel Walther and Brian Newbert and some of Ray's proteges would come and work on these outfits, and we'd get to be around him and watch how they could handle yearlings by themselves, rope them, get them down, doctor them without tying them up, go up there, take their, and generally be a horseback before that yearling ever got back up. And it wasn't because that yearling had been stressed. It was because they knew exactly what was in that yearling's mind by his not only attitude that you can see in a bovine's face, but also all the other little secrets that you can pick up if you're aware. And if you have somebody showing you how to be aware, it makes it so much easier than try to learn yourself, you know. I went, I believe I was 27 years old when I went to Ray's first clinic. And I was just as excited about it at 40, and maybe more so at 50. Because when you have been helped and you understand more than you ever did before, it was great. I was never the best bronc rider on the crew. I was never the best roper on the crew. I was never the most cow-savvy guy on the crew. But being born and raised on a ranch, I'd go over that next ridge and check on the water. I'd ride up to the saddle and check on the salt. I would know where the men are and who got dropped off where, and if somebody didn't show up, I knew which draw we better start down, see if his horse rolled on him or something. And that's why I got to be jigger boss and then boss. And one thing I learned about being boss, and I think this new president ought to learn this, a good boss is only as good as his crew. You put good men around you, men you can trust, men you like, men that aren't going to cause trouble in camp, men that have sense enough not to put their TP on a red anthill. Those guys can make a crew awful good. And I had guys like Larry Schutte and Ross Knox and Mikey Thomas, Tom Martin. Well, I can go on, but these guys have all become famous cowboys. And that's because the young guys make them that way, because now that they're old, they know more. And I think these young guys getting into this aren't getting into it because they're looking for prestige or money. They're getting into it because they're a cowboy and they're just looking for a place to be at home.
We'll pick up where we left off on the next episode, but While I was spending time with Waddie, he was gracious enough to read one of his brand new poems for me, and I'd like to share that with you to close out today's show.
You know, it's said, good sleep can make or break, give pleasure or cause strife, can keep your body mobile or can crankify your life, give you that spark you're needing or can make your tail uncurl. Good rest makes all the difference in the way we see the world. And gals make our beds inviting, soothe and please the senses well, but well, they're doing something nowadays, and the why is hard to tell. They heap the beds full of 'em, make no sense to us fellas. A lot of things we understand. But what's with all the fellas? What's one supposed to do with them? Why are they even there? 2 per head seems ample, maybe 1 more for a spare, but more than that seems useless. It's like lugging 10 umbrellas. We go along with a lot of things, but what's with all the fellas? We have to strip 'em off at night like we need one more chore. Our friend's house I stayed at had 13 or maybe more, and no one teaches protocol. Are we to put 'em back the way they were upon the bed or leave 'em in a stack? Do we stuff 'em in a closet? Do we put 'em on a chair? If they don't serve a purpose, what's the purpose being there? So for future reference wishes, I beg this to be referred. I just would like 2 fellas, please. The sleeping kind's preferred.
All right, folks, that's it for this episode. Thank you to Waddie Mitchell for taking the time to visit with me. I'll have part 2 of our conversation on the next episode. You can find out more about Waddie at waddiemitchell.com. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com/Cowboy Crossroads. If you'd like to help me keep this show going, you can make a donation on the website. Or you can rate the show on iTunes and leave a comment and subscribe so that you'll never miss an episode. If you'd like to contact me with comments or questions, please email Andy at andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.